Okay, good morning, everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started with today's press briefing. As always, as you have questions, please post them in the chat feature. Let me know who you are and what outlet you're with.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for signing on today. I hope everyone had a good Labor Day weekend, enjoying the warm weather this weekend before today's much more fall-like conditions. So I wanted to share a few updates about the weather and some of the impacts that it's had on our schools. Our operations team has been monitoring the weather as we have many students who are returning for in-person learning in our early childhood centers today, as well as participating in our Discovery Link childcare program, and also beginning to take advantage of our remote learning support centers. Today we did have to close 6 sites, many of which were food distribution or childcare sites for families, given the drop in temperature and some issues that we had with our heating systems in those buildings. Our operations team is working to restore heating, and for the time being, students will be able to use space at other sites. We've contacted all of our families participating in those programs to let them know of those changes over the weekend. More information about the sites that were impacted can be found online on our homepage. The most exciting news about today is welcoming back our early childhood education centers, students into those schools. I started my day at Pasquale Ledoux Academy and was just so excited to see all of our teachers, school leaders getting ready to welcome students back into our early childhood centers. So we started with our 4 early childhood programs today in our ECE centers, and we'll have the majority of the rest of our early childhood centers opening up, programs opening up in our schools beginning next Monday on the 14th. We do want to remind all of our families that you will need to decide by September 14th if you want to send your preschoolers for in-person learning in our schools, so that in the event that you don't want to send your children, we can offer those slots to students who are on our waiting list. But we had some great photos from this morning. Maybe we can see if we can get some of those out and shared. The next thing that I wanted to share was about the NAACP versus Devos ruling. We have some really great news for DPS students as well as students across the country in the recent federal court case that Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos and the U.S. Department of Education cannot divert desperately needed funds away from public schools into private schools. The court ruled that Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos and the U.S. Department of Education violated the clear language of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which is also known as the CARES Act. So public schools across the country now will have the full amount of CARES Act funding to which they are entitled. This lawsuit was led by the NAACP, public school parents, and school districts across the country, and aimed to protect critical COVID-19 aid for public schools and their students. As the COVID-19 health crisis continues, we will continue to fight on behalf of our students, and we will continue to advocate for equitable funding, equitable access to funding that will support our most vulnerable students. So that was a really great news to get over the weekend. So we'd love to open it up to see if there are any questions that you have about these topics or any others.
Great. All right. Our first question from Sonia with 9 News. Will you still have snow days? That's been a popular question this morning.
Hi, Sonia. Yeah, thank you for that question. I have been saying that, the silver lining to what we are learning about the pandemic is the opportunity to continue learning even with the need to go into a quarantine or potentially even the need around extreme weather conditions. And so our hope is that we're going to be able to stay connected with our students much more closely via technology because we know how critical, particularly in a year like this year, it's going to be to maximize learning time. So we have not made any firm decisions about how we'll handle inclement weather that typically would have led to a snow day, but my sense is we will be able to stay connected to our students via technology, even when the weather doesn't allow us to get out on the roads.
Thank you. And from Melanie with Chalkbeat, any update on when schools might reopen before October 16th based on the stoplight metrics or COVID dashboard? And how many free learning centers are open today? How many do you expect to open this week?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. Really important question. So we have been monitoring our dashboard really closely, along with monitoring the conditions in our schools for a safe re-entry into our programs. One of the thresholds that we made a commitment to was ensuring that all PPE was received in buildings to be able to have a safe and safe return to in-person in addition to the COVID categories. I think it's really important that we do everything that we can to support that safe and gradual return. Our teachers and leaders have been deeply focused on quality experiences with virtual learning. And so as we begin to pivot, we don't have a firm date set yet. In fact, we'll be having conversations later today about what is feasible, both in terms of tracking where we are with all of the PPE in buildings to be able to share more about that, hopefully within the coming week.
Thank you. And again, if you have questions, go ahead and use the chat feature. Oh, yes. I'm sorry, Melanie. A question for Melanie, just how many learning centers are open as of right now?
Yeah, so thanks, Melanie. We actually asked our schools to work on that within their school community. So by the end of the day, I'll have a better sense of how many students have been received in our remote learning support centers. I don't yet have feedback on that, but I'd be happy to get back to you.
Great. And a question that I've gotten, I'll just pose for the good of the group, is how many students do we have on those ECE wait lists, and what will the process be to move them in?
Yeah, so thank you. Our ECE programs are limited by licensing requirements to student to staff ratios. The majority of our ECE centers serve 16 students at a time. Some are half-day programs, but many are full-day programs. And so if there are students on wait lists, we have been calling them to ensure that they, if they are interested in being in person, they have access to those programs. Typically, it really depends by neighborhood. Some neighborhoods have very long, extensive wait lists. Others may not have quite as many. We do know, I know from my visit at Pasquale Ledoux this morning, that the majority of their classrooms are close to being full as students begin to come in person. Many schools are looking at having staggered entry times. And so when I was there, not all students were in yet. We are looking at things like designated times for drop off and pick up so that we can limit the number of students and adults that are coming in at any given time, but really excited to be able to welcome them back in.
Thank you. And from Sonia with 9 News, do you have a timeline on the heating for those 6 buildings? How many students and staff are impacted by this?
Yeah, it's different in each of the different cases. Some of the sites were food distribution sites. And so while we may not have students in the building, we would have had staff who are helping distribute food. We are continuing to use some of those sites, just making the food in a different location and bringing it for distribution to those places. We had a couple issues with boilers where we're waiting for parts. We anticipate that all of the buildings will be back up and functioning, hopefully by Thursday at the latest.
Okay, and last call for questions. Okay, we have John from the Denver Post. How many early childhood education centers open today for in-person? And is that the first in-person that DPS has done?
Yeah, thank you. So we had 4 early childhood centers that opened for in-person classes today. These are the first regularly scheduled classes for students and teachers. As a reminder, we did run summer camp this summer through Discovery Link, and we have been offering Discovery Link remote learning support childcare at over 40 sites throughout the city for elementary school age students. And then today, many of our schools will begin the process of remote learning support centers in their schools, staffed with their own support staff in their buildings.
Great. Some questions back to the weather. Sonia with 9 News asks, are you considering switching to e-learning on snow days as opposed to canceling school, and how would that work logistically? Would you always need to make sure kids are going home with laptops the day before a snowstorm? And finally, will you be able to make a decision on a snow day a little later?
Yeah, so thank you. So the good news about our support for students with technology is we actually are going to be asking our students to use their technology on a regular basis when we're in person or when kids are going home. And so it'll be a lot more like taking your, your backpack with your books. We'll want kids to be able to continue to use their Chromebooks all the time. It will really be helpful. Many of the concerns that we had in the past about kids having access to the internet to complete homework, for example, will not be an issue any longer. So we are going to be asking our students to use their Chromebooks just like they would any of their other school materials, taking it back and forth, making sure it's charged overnight, things like that. So sort of the equivalent back when I was a student of having your pencil sharpened, we want to make sure our Chromebooks are charged when we get to school. So kids will be able to take them back and forth when we're in person. It'll be great because then, like I said, they'll be able to complete their schoolwork via technology, which is something that we know most of us do for our regular work, and the majority of students are doing as well now. In terms of calling a snow day, I think it will definitely take some of the pressure off to determine how we do that. And frankly, it might make it feel a little bit easier to call it earlier as opposed to later, because it doesn't have the disruption of canceling school for the day, something that I know we've always tried to weigh the pros and cons of, but I think will allow us to continue sort of unfazed with an approach to learning going forward. So that might be a little bit nicer.
Okay, well, if that's it, we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. Any follow-up questions, just follow up with me directly, and we'll see you back here next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.